The long-awaited Sentinel of Rinascita is finally here. So, let's find out how to build and play Cartethyia. First, let's see how to actually level her up. These are all the materials needed to level her up, including her talent materials. The two new materials you'll see here are the Unfading Glory, which is a boss material, and the Bamboo Iris, which is the flower material you will need for Cartethyia. She will need the Fleur-de-Lis weekly boss material, and finally, she will need the Tidal Residue from the standard enemies around the world, and the standard sword materials. Because Cartethyia is actually two resonators at once, I'll put either Cartethyia or Fleur-de-Lis's name in the top right corner of the screen. So, whenever I'm talking about Cartethyia's kit or buffs she would get, her name will be up and vice versa. First, let's find out how to use Cartethyia. Cartethyia has a 4 basic attack string, with her 4th attack applying 1 arrow erosion stack whilst also summoning 1 basic attack sword. Her intro skill will deal some damage, apply 2 arrow erosion whilst also summoning an intro sword. Her charge attack will deal some damage whilst also summoning 1 intro sword, which is the same as your intro skill, so you don't necessarily need to use your heavy attack. And finally, her resonance skill will knock enemies up into the air before slamming them back down. This will deal basic attack damage, it will apply 2 arrow erosion stacks on each enemy hit, whilst also summoning 1 skill sword. But that's not all, since it will also make Cartethyia levitate in the air, making her able to do a plunge attack. When you have at least 1 sword, you can use your plunge attack to activate the sword whilst dealing a good amount of damage, which also counts as arrow erosion damage. And the more swords you activate at once, the more damage the plunge attack will have. Activating these sword stacks is quite important for her Fleur-de-Lis form, and we will go over those effects in just a minute. Once you've activated all the swords, you can use your liberation and transform into Fleur-de-Lis. Fleur-de-Lis has her own forte circuit, intro skill, basic attacks, dodge counter, heavy attack, enhanced heavy attack, mid-air attacks, mid-air heavy attacks, jump attacks, resonance skill and resonance liberation. First, let's take a look at her forte bar before going over all of her abilities. Fleur-de-Lis's forte bar is made up of 120 points. You can gain these points by doing any of the previously named abilities. And once it's full, you can use her resonance liberation. But let's rewind a bit. First, let's take a look what happens when you cast your liberation. After transforming into Fleur-de-Lis, she will reduce her max health to 50% unless you're already below 50% HP, whilst also entering the enhanced state for 12 seconds. This state increases Fleur-de-Lis's arrow damage by 60%. And whilst you're Fleur-de-Lis, your basic attack 5, mid-air attack 2 and resonance skill 2 will instantly trigger an arrow erosion and reduce it by 1 stack. Now let's go over what each sword does. And just a reminder, the sword effects will only be active whilst the enhanced state is active. The basic attack sword, summoned by her basic attacks, will reduce nearby enemies' wind erosion intervals by 50%, whilst also increasing wind erosion damage to them by 50%. So, this will make the arrow erosion trigger every 1.5 seconds instead of the usual 3 seconds. The intro sword, summoned by her intro skill or heavy attack, will make Fleur-de-Lis her basic attack 5, mid-air attack 2, enhanced charge attack and resonance skill 2 raise all arrow erosion stacks on all nearby targets to the highest amount amongst all targets. And the skill sword, summoned by her resonance skill, will grant her 4th basic attack an AoE force field which will stagnate all enemies around the attack, whilst also granting Fleur-de-Lis increased interruption to resistance. And finally, we have her resonance liberation. Blade of Howling Squall. Once you've filled up your forte bar completely by doing any of the aforementioned abilities, you can use your liberation to deal a massive nuke in a straight line, whilst also restoring 50% max HP. The damage dealt by this attack can be further increased based on the amount of arrow erosion stacks on the enemy, since for every arrow erosion stack on the enemy, the total damage will be increased by 20% up to 5 times. However, all enemies hit will lose their arrow erosion stacks. After this, you can swap off of Cartethyia to activate her auto skill. This auto skill will increase all damage done by party members by 17.5% if the enemy has a negative effect on them. Now, as for her inherent skills, The first will increase the healing done by the entire team by 20% after casting her auto skill, and they will gain more resistance to interruption. And if Arrow Rover is on the team, Rover will restore 25 wind string points after casting Resonance Liberation. As for the second, it will increase Cartethyia's and Fleur-de-Lis's damage to a target by 30% if they have 1 to 3 stacks of Arrow Erosion on them, with every stack above 3 increasing it by an additional 10% with a maximum of 3 stacks. This will make the maximum amount of damage increase of this inherent skill 60%. Also, another good thing to know is that her circuit nodes grant a total of 12% bonus HP and 8% crit rate. As for her leveling recommendations, I recommend leveling her Forte Circuit and Resonance Liberation first, since this is where a lot of her damage is coming from. After that, you can level her basic attacks, since her Forte Circuit Sword plunge attack scalings are behind her basic attacks. And finally, you can follow this with her Resonance and Intro skill. Cartethyia scales off of HP %, so most weapons won't really work efficiently on her. But luckily, a lot of her damage scales off of basic attack damage, as well as her big Liberation nuke scaling off of Resonance Liberation damage. So, the first sword I'll recommend is none other than the Defier's Thorn, Cartethyia's signature weapon. It comes with a really low 412 base attack, but to compensate, it also comes with a massive 72.2% max HP. As for the passive, besides granting an additional 12% max HP, for 15 seconds after casting an intro skill or basic attack, the damage dealt by her ignores 8% defense. And if the enemy has at least 1 stack of arrow erosion on them, the damage to that enemy will be amplified by 20%. This is obviously a very strong weapon for Cartethyia, and other swords are gonna struggle to even compare with it. However, Camelia's signature weapon, the Red Spring, will be a pretty good alternative for her. Although it grants 587 base attack, which is quite literally useless for her, it does come with 24.3% crit rate, and the passive will grant her a total of 30% basic attack damage besides the standard and pretty useless 12% attack. This makes the weapon actually a pretty decent option. If you have the Emerald of Genesis, you will also be fine, since this weapon, although only good for the 24.3% crit rate, is still one of the better options. All of the 4-star options lack crit rate, and they all have attack %. So your best free-to-play option will be the Guardian Sword, granting 300 base attack and 30.4% max HP. And even though the passive grants a maximum of 24% skill damage, the max HP substat will be making this weapon a lot better than the 4-star options. Cartethyia caught wind of the new Echo set, and she really wants to use it. This set is none other than the Windward Pilgrimage. The 2-piece will grant her 10% arrow damage bonus, whilst the 5-piece will increase her crit rate by 10%, whilst also increasing her arrow damage bonus by 30% for 10 seconds whenever she attacks an enemy with arrow erosion. For the active Echo, she'll want to use none other than Fleur-de-Lis herself, since it grants her 20% arrow damage bonus just by having it equipped. As for her Echo setup, she'll actually want to use the 4-4-1-1-1. That is because of the high amount of damage bonuses she gets from her kit and the lack of crit on her weapon. This is doable since there are multiple 4-cost Echoes in the set. With this setup, you want crit rate or crit damage on the 4 costs and HP % on the 1 cost. For the substats, she'll want crit rate, crit damage, HP %, energy recharge, at least 15% to make it comfortable, basic attack and liberation damage bonus, and finally some flat HP wouldn't hurt.
Let the show begin!
Cartethyia has a couple different teams. Luckily, there are also a couple free-to-play options. First, let's get the obvious out of the way. Shakona, the previously released Resonator, is going to be her best in slot Resonator, granting a lot of arrow erosion, 10% arrow resistance reduction if you have her weapon, and 100% arrow damage amp, as well as 24% arrow damage bonus. And if you manage to get her S2, she'll grant an additional 40% arrow damage bonus when using her liberation. Because she applies arrow erosion, she can also make use of the arrow erosion sub DPS set, which grants the active Resonator 15% arrow damage bonus. However, if you don't have Shakona, Sanwa or Alto are both great options. First, let's take a quick look at Sanwa. Sanwa's main buff is basic attack damage amp, And since quite a bit of Cartethyia's damage is basic attack damage, she will be a pretty good option. However, the attack buffs she grants are quite useless since Cartethyia is a HP scaler. As for Alto grants an arrow damage amp which will apply on all of Cartethyia's damage, including her big liberation nuke. And just like Sanwa, Alto's attack buffs will be rendered useless. You'll definitely want Arrow Rover on Cartethyia's team, since she grants an increase to the max amount of arrow erosion stacks on the enemy, which is needed to reach the maximum amount of buffs Fleur-de-Lis can get. Now, for the supports, you could run Verina, Baiji, Shorekeeper or Arrow Rover. Personally, I like using Arrow Rover as the healer, since she grants quite a bit of healing. Of course, Verina and Baiji are also usable, but they don't grant too many buffs to Cartethyia, so you're better off using Shorekeeper or support Arrow Rover.
Pent. For silence beckons.
After casting your intro on Cartethyia, you want to use basic attack 2, 3 and 4. After which you want to use your resonance skill and plunge attack the enemy, which consumes all swords. Then you want to transform into Fleur-de-Lis.
Face your destruction.
First up, we have Sequence 1. Sequence 1 will grant Cartethyia or Fleur-de-Lis Zeal when defeating an enemy for 10 seconds. Zeal will record the highest stacks amongst the targets defeated and will apply it on another enemy with her next attack. This has a second cooldown. But that's not all, since she has another effect on her S1. Each time Fleur-de-Lis's Forte bar hits 25%, she will gain 25% crit damage for 15 seconds. This effect stacks, but it doesn't refresh the duration. And after casting her Liberation, it will remove all stacks. Sequence 2 will increase the maximum arrow erosion stacks achievable for nearby enemies by 3 after casting her transformation. With the next attack inflicting 3 arrow erosion stacks on all enemies hit, whilst immediately triggering arrow erosion damage on targets without consuming the stack. And just like S1, S2 also has a second effect. The damage multipliers of Cartethyia's basic attack, heavy attack, dodge counter and intro skill are increased by 50%, whilst her plunge attack is increased by 200%. And after casting her plunge attack, each sword recalled will lower the cooldown of her resonance skill by 1 second. Sequence 3 will allow Fleur-de-Lis to apply 2 stacks of arrow erosion by using her basic attack 5, mid-air attack 3, enhanced heavy attack or her resonance skill's second cast, whilst also increasing the damage multiplier of her massive nuke by 100%. Sequence 4 will increase all resonators damage by 20% after someone inflicts a negative effect for 20 seconds. Sequence 5 will save Cartethyia or Fleur-de-Lis from a fatal blow, while shielding her for 20% of Cartethyia's max HP for 10 seconds. This effect can be triggered once every 10 minutes, and her liberation health cost is reduced to 25%. Now, finally, as for Sequence 6. After casting her big nuke, raise all arrow erosion stacks on the enemies to the max. But that's not all. After casting Cartethyia's intro skill, Fleur-de-Lis's intro skill, her transformation or her big nuke, she will gain a new effect. For 30 seconds, when anyone applies arrow erosion on a target with max arrow erosion stacks, the arrow erosion will instantly trigger the damage once. And as for the cherry on top, Fleur-de-Lis will deal 40% more damage.
The haunting whispers return.
Cartethyia is an absolute unit of a DPS character, dealing lots of damage in quite a big AoE. She is probably going to be one of the best, if not the best DPSs for a while, so she will definitely be a good investment for your account. She has both basic attack damage, liberation damage and arrow erosion damage, although the arrow erosion damage is unlike Zani, since the arrow erosion is actually the main focus of the arrow erosion damage. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, may I recommend the video on the screen right now. I appreciate you all. Bye bye.